Can you just briefly tell me your name and where you're from?
Susana. I'm from the south side of the city of Chicago, Illinois.
You had a loved one who was incarcerated?
I did, yes.
And who was that person, and what periods were they incarcerated for?
That person was incarcerated in death row back in the 90s, up until 1996. So when you're incarcerated 23 hours and you only have an hour to be released out in the yard or to work out or do anything ancillary to being in your cell, it starts taking effect on you mentally and on your family members. It's a huge cost and a burden to your family members because you're in essence isolated for any real human contact. And if someone has the opportunity to come to visit you, it's very expensive, very time consuming, which then results in you taking time off of work and you making less money and a complete burden on your family. And so for someone who sits in a cell within four walls, within the cell that you're placed in, your mind starts going, and also you really don't have a normal life. I mean, I understand we have a rehabilitation system, quote unquote, enacted by legislation, but we also need to have at least some basic human rights for prisoners. There's a time period where your mind starts wandering. You have suicidal tendencies. You have these hallucinations sometimes, based on whether you're actually having the level of self-care. If you don't have a strong constitution where you're prayerful, where you're able to communicate with another human, it starts dehumanizing yourself, where you actually start breaking down, knowing how to relate to another human being. I mean, imagine having a dog. Even dogs get walked, once or at minimum twice a day. And animals are animals and humans are humans. And so a part of your brain starts deactivating in a way where it just becomes matter of fact. You're just existing. Death row visitation is much different than general population because you have, in essence, less time with the person because they are on death row. I mean, you can see them like once a week for, if I remember correctly, it was like maybe an hour visit. And so you're sometimes traveling 2 hours just to see, actually 2 hours one way, being with the person for an hour and then driving two hours back. And so part of the process as an extended family member thinking about your loved one is, you have a lot of thoughts, what happens to them, how do they survive, what's their state, being, what do they do all day long, what do they think about? Luckily, he had a strong constitution and a strong faith in order to get him through, and to that extent, he was able to paint in order to get through his day, and he created a blessing out of his situation. He was later released after, being in prison, from 17, as young as 17 or 18 years old. And a majority of his life had already been gone. And so the effects of having him come back out and into a reality where he had been so far removed from humans, to an extent. And so, what happens to a human when you're finally released? Well, Maya Angelou says, when you have, I understand why the cage bird sings. And through his experience, I actually understood why, when he was released, why he then incarcerated himself into a room, and why he really didn't feel like he could have a normal life, or that he even deserved to have a life. And seeing how his relationships with his family members, his children, were so disintegrated that he had started, having a lot of mental issues, abusing alcohol, trying to really find himself again, and he found himself in a world that he really didn't know who he was and what he was supposed to be doing. And it doesn't matter how much you pray about that and how strong your faith constitution is, the mental decapitalization that happens to you, the mental quality that you have at that point, and what happens to your family around you. I mean, the arguments about who's going to actually give him money this week to even get like the usual, the toiletries or anything else, or people going into debt, or how much money you spent on your phone bill, to the tune of, if you're even lucky to get a phone call. And when you look on the opposite end of how much money, millions that we're giving out in contracts, it just doesn't seem to be a justified way of creating a reality for folks. Granted, if you were convicted of something a crime that you committed, there has to be a penalty. But even in the international level, there are rights for humans as prisoners, and we need to maintain a better system in that where we do not kill people, because the current system that we have kills people, it kills families, and it kills humans. The importance of this state bill is that, in light of the recent Laquan McDonald case and the myriad of years that our state has had with torture victims, past the John Birch cases, prior to all the death penalty reform that was worked upon in the 90s, we have the opportunity to change what happens in our state. And politically, we're at a crossroads where we have to lead. And one of the opportunities that we have right now is that we've never been closer to having a state bill like this. And we need people to rally around the fact that this is not who we are as a state, and that we need to change the system that we currently have today.